Welcome to part 2 of the Tocqueville Center's April event and the last Tocqueville event of the academic year. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. The Tocqueville Center is dedicated to exploring the big questions that guide our political life in America. One way to do that is to bring in prominent scholars and public intellectuals who have something to say and let them loose on a topic. The result has been better than we could have imagined this year. As we look back on the 14 CLPs we have hosted, which has to be some kind of record. I don't know who keeps track of these things, but we've nailed it, I'm sure. We see that we have entered into debates on Tocqueville's view of America in light of his later political career in France, the decline of social capital and church attendance on American democracy, the role of social equality on the evolution of free enterprise in the US, the impact of civil rights on the American Black experience, the place of conservatism in an age of populism, and the potent mix of religion and nationalism in parts of America. Which brings us to this week and our focus on Catholic political thought in America. Now, as I said last night, I have been asked by colleagues why we would choose to highlight political currents within American Catholicism at a formerly Baptist institution, to which I have two responses. First, Tocqueville was a Catholic, or at least he was a cultural Catholic, and he found it fascinating that in 1830, Catholicism was flourishing in a nation founded by English Puritans. And that remains the case today, which leads to my second response, which is that if you doubt the impact of Catholics on American politics, just look at the occupant of the White House. That's Patrick Deneen's influence. I don't know where he is. There he is right there, who reminded me of Joe Biden last night. And take a look at our current Supreme Court, where 7 of 9 justices are Catholic. So we have to take note of Catholic political thought in America. Last night we heard from Patrick Deneen. Tonight we hear from 2 additional prominent Catholic voices, Ross Douthat and Leah Sargeant. And afterwards we'll assemble a response panel, which includes Professor Deneen as well as one more, Emily Crowder, but we'll get to her in a minute. So let me introduce the 2 speakers. Ross Douthat earned his BA from Harvard University and eventually joined the New York Times as an opinion columnist in April 2009. His column appears every Tuesday and Sunday. He is also a host on the weekly opinion podcast, Matter of Opinion, and writes film criticism for National Review. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger on its website. He is the author of several books, including The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Grand New Party, How the Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. Yeah, sometimes we're a little embarrassed by some of those publications, but it's not over yet. It's not over yet, right? And then Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. His most recent book is a personal memoir called The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery. Leah Libresco Sargeant earned a BA from Yale and went on to do several amazing things before becoming a freelance writer covering religion, statistics. Now, do those 2 things go together? You have to ask her. Ask Jim Guth, he knows how they go together. And as much theater as she can get tickets for. So we actually have 2 cultural critics here tonight, as well as Catholic political thinkers. I'm going to, as she mentioned last night, she is also a lobbyist on Capitol Hill, but I'll let her explain her day job if she wishes to later in the program. Leah's writing has appeared in First Things, America, The American Conservative, Commonweal, The American Interest, and other publications. She is the author of Arriving at Amen, 7 Catholic prayers that even I can offer, and tells a story of how she learned to pray. Her second book, Building the Benedict Option, a guide to gathering 2 or 3 together in his name, is a guide to building thicker Christian community. She is the author of the substack, Other Feminisms, as well. So first we'll hear from Ross Douthat. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be back at Furman. I want to deny, for the record, though, that I have been disappointed in my prophecies in Grand New Party. Republicans have emphatically won the working class, and I'm sure that saving the American dream is right around the corner. For those reading the transcript, there was intended to be a trace of irony in those remarks. So, we've been invited to speak on the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholic political thought in America. And I want to raise the question of to what extent such a thing can really be said to exist at all, which is a wild overstatement. So let me offer the understated version, which is to say that Catholic political thought in America has always faced a profound problem of figuring out how to engage with a nation whose currency, I'm going to use this as my prop. Some of you are probably too young to recognize paper money, but for those of you who this is of course the father of our country, George Washington. This is the $1 bill, and if you turn it around, you will find stamped on the back side, just across from the Great Seal of the United States, a famous symbol of the Masonic Order, an order that Catholics are forbidden under pain of excommunication, is that right? Yeah. To be members of. In fact, I am a parishioner at St. Mary's Church in New Haven, Connecticut, one of the founding churches of the Knights of Columbus, an entire order for American Catholics created precisely because, this is itself an overstatement, American Catholic men needed something to do with their time besides joining the Masons. So this is sort of a peculiar situation where clearly not just non-Catholicism, but something quite alien to Catholicism is bound up in some way with the founding of the United States of America in ways that I think creates inherent difficulties for Catholic engagement with American life and political culture has from the 19th century, from Tocqueville's time all the way down to the present day. And I'll pass from one prop to, not a prop, but something that, an essay that I read basically as I was on my way here that I thought would be another useful exhibit in my argument about the sort of this inherent problem. It's an essay by another noted Catholic writer, almost as noted as the three of us, Sohrab Ahmari. He has a new essay in the journal Liberties that is entitled The Poverty of Catholic Intellectual Life, and it is a strong clarion call for Catholics not to reject the non-Catholic aspects of American life as irredeemably corrupt, but to engage fully with the American democratic patrimony. I will quote him, since I'm citing the essay. He concludes by saying, "To advance the common good today, to act, in the words of the Gospel of St. Matthew, as salt and light, the American Catholic intellectual must enter this drama," meaning the drama of American life, American democracy, American history, wrestling with its contradictions, sincerely celebrating its achievements, and yes, scrutinizing its shortcomings in the light of the moral absolutes that we believe are inscribed in the hearts of all men and women. I want to endorse that sentiment, but then I want to note that much of Amari's essay is dedicated to an extensive discussion of a man that he considers one of the two most important sort of Catholic political intellectual figures in pre-Civil War America, and that is a justice of the Supreme Court who some of you may know, named Roger Taney. If any of you know anything about Roger Taney, you probably know that he is the author of the Dred Scott decision, widely considered the worst Supreme Court decision in American history. So he is deeply associated with pro-slavery arguments from antebellum America. And Amari makes a fascinating case that Taney's legacy was actually much more complicated and interesting than that he had a long career as a Jacksonian populist, advancing arguments about the common good that he later betrayed in his judicial advocacy for slavery, but that represent, in the essay's telling, a fascinating piece of sort of Catholic American history that today's Catholics can look back to and be interested in and draw lessons from. Along with Taney, Amari also mentions as the other most prominent 19th century American Catholic intellectual, the journalist and writer and activist Orestes Brownson, who was, I think, those of you who were here last night, I think heard a couple of mentions from him by Patrick Deneen, and I think Patrick accurately described Brownson as basically carrying on the argument about whether Catholics could be good Americans and whether America could be good Catholics with both sides inside his own head, right? So you can find essays by Brownson making a pro-American case for the reconciliation of Catholic ideas in American life, and a case that, in fact, there was sort of some inherent tension between the two. So those are our figures. If we're reaching back, to the first 75 years of our republic's history, we're looking for intellectual Catholic antecedents for today's Catholic intellectual life, and we find the most notorious jurist in all of American history, and a potent intellectual who couldn't decide himself what Catholics should think about the United States. I would submit to you that this presents or clarifies or illustrates, whatever term you want to use, a real problem for Catholic intellectual life 100 or 200 or 250, I guess. We're going on 250 years later. And I would frame the problem this way, and I'll be curious what others think about this, which is that any form of Catholic Americanness is inevitably an act of cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation being sort of a term of art that shows up often in progressive, so-called woke discourse, usually as a term of critique. You're not supposed to appropriate other cultures. You're not supposed to dress up as a Native American for Halloween. You're not supposed to get too into, Congolese culture if you're a white American. You're not supposed to get too into East Asian culture if you're a Northern European. These kind of, lines of demarcation that progressive orthodoxy sometimes tries to draw. In general, as a non-progressive, I think a lot of those, I think a lot of that discourse is basically absurd, and that cultural appropriation is just sort of a necessary part of how culture itself changes and advances. But I think it's a useful term for thinking about what Catholic intellectuals are doing with America itself. They are looking at a nation founded by Protestants, a couple of Catholics, the Carrolls of Maryland were there at the beginning, but let's be honest, America was founded by a mixture of Protestants, deists, people often with strong anti-Catholic impulses and convictions, true in different ways of both the right and the left, the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, not a big fan of Catholicism on the left. John Adams on the New England right, also not a big fan of Catholicism, right? Made his famous visit to a Catholic mass and was sort of taken with it, was like, this is kind of immersive and impressive, but ultimately came away horrified. It's just the slavery that's imposed upon mass-going Catholics and so on, right? So that's where it starts. That's where the American experiment starts. That is the foundation, right? And so every form of sort of Catholic Americanness, every project that has been adopted and undertaken has had to appropriate the raw materials of a basically Protestant past and try and turn it to Catholic uses. And you see this, I would submit, in all kinds of the different varieties of Catholic political thought sort of on the market today. Again, I think some of which Professor Deneen sketched last night, probably in ways that I would mostly agree with, right? But, you have, I think, from both sort of conventionally conservative Catholics and what we think of as sort of conventionally liberal Catholics, let's say Paul Ryan and Joe Biden, right, as figures. You have a kind of appropriation of mid-century America, right, as sort of this moment when there was this sort of Vatican II era intersection between sort of Catholic, the evolution of the global church and the American experiment, right, where you had this sort of period of maximal strength for the American Catholic Church that was also sort of the period of New Deal liberalism succeeded by a kind of Eisenhower era socially conservative consensus. There are a lot, that's a lot of Catholic thought has been dedicated to basically trying to sort of treat that as sort of normative Americanness and say it was friendly to Catholicism, therefore it is sort of the model of a Catholic America to which we should aspire. And then various critiques will look at that era and say, oh, this was time-bound and temporary and destined to be swept away, and in fact, the forms of liberal and conservative politics that emerged in that era that yielded Mario Cuomo and Ronald Reagan and so forth down to the contemporary divisions of today were actually ultimately hostile to the flourishing of Catholicism. And so you have to look back, you have to look somewhere else, right? And so, for instance, there's arguments that say, well, actually, elements of a classical legal tradition. This is an argument associated with Professor Adrian Vermeule of Harvard Law School, among many other figures. They'll say elements of the classical legal tradition with its roots in pre-revolutionary America, with its roots in the Catholic Middle Ages, that survived in 19th century America and formed sort of the basis of a lot of American jurisprudence until some point in the late 19th or early 20th century, at which point the plot was lost, progressivism took over, and originalism as a constitutional doctrine is an insufficient answer, and so you have to somehow return or revive that kind of classical legal tradition, and that is sort of the usable past, the usable version of the American past that Catholics can reach for. Again, notwithstanding that almost all of the jurists practicing classical legal or instantiating classical legal principles in 19th century America were practicing Protestants, right? So those are a couple of examples. I don't want to go on, I don't want to sort of multiply them too far. But I think that is, no matter what, I think there's a version of this with Tocqueville himself, but we can get into that a bit more and maybe in the back and forth. But I think part of the challenge too with these projects of appropriation, right, is that you're trying to do something that's a bit different from the kind of cultural appropriation that Catholic Christianity has always taken pride in, right, which is the idea of sort of the spoils of Egypt, the idea that Catholicism is founded on a sort of takeover, a defeat of paganism, a defeat of classical antiquity, where you sort of, take the remnants of classical culture, take the best out of classical culture, remix it, reinterpret it, and you get, sort of the survival of the classical in the new world of Catholic Christendom. America is not a pagan society, notwithstanding some sort of interpretations of Freemasonry, not really a pagan society, but a Protestant society. And so any kind of Catholic appropriation is doing something different from what Christians were doing in the Roman Empire. It's basically trying to take a different form of Christian culture, appropriate some things from it, reinterpret them, make them new, and sort of enfold them into a Catholic idea of what American politics should look like. And I don't know if that's necessarily a harder challenge than doing the same thing with pagan antiquity, but it's definitely a different kind of challenge, and a novel one that Catholic intellectual life doesn't have sort of obvious experiences of to reach back towards. So anyway, that's the sort of general framing of the challenge, and then let me just add a sort of a particular peculiarity of the challenge, which is that you could say, well, there's this challenge, but it's sort of it's an abstraction, right? It's a thing for political theorists and theologians to argue about, but in practice, Catholics just need to live out their faith, right, in the context of a pluralist society in which Catholicism is not likely to become a majority religion anytime soon, and let the intellectuals worry about the intellectual problems, right? And I have some sympathy for that perspective, but there is this difficulty, which is that on the one hand, there is sort of an inherent tension between Catholic ideas and the Protestant American inheritance. On the other hand, as was noted in the list of Supreme Court justices, Catholics increasingly supply most of the intelligentsia for one of the two American political coalitions, and also are represented in the other coalition as well, including obviously by the current President of the United States. And this pattern has, if anything, I think, accelerated and intensified even as mass Catholicism has weakened over the last, 40 or 50 years ago, you would have said Catholicism as a mass religion is, in pretty good shape, and as an elite project is relatively weak. I think today you'd say the reverse. I think Catholicism as an elite project looks stronger at the very least than any Protestant alternative. If you spend time hanging around the institutions of modern American conservatism, you will find more Catholics than you did 20 or 30 years ago, and no sort of clear, full community of sort of Protestant interpretation as an alternative. Not that there aren't plenty of, especially evangelical Protestants, in elite American life, but essentially the American Conservative Coalition, which, as its name suggests, is dedicated to sort of, in theory, safeguarding and stewarding the American inheritance, is increasingly led by an intellectual class that carries with it this inherent tension between its own beliefs and the actual history of the beliefs and ideologies that gave rise to the American experiment in the first place. And that, I think, makes the problem that I've described a more urgent one than it would be if this were not the case and Catholicism was, stronger in the pews and weaker among the elites. The more influence that Catholicism has in elite life, in conservative intellectual life especially, the more essential it becomes, I guess, to figure out what exactly about the inheritance of a Protestant country Catholics want to appropriate, what they can and what they can't. But that does not actually, the necessity of the task does not actually provide you with a blueprint for carrying out the task. And I've exceeded my allotted 15 minutes, which is good because I don't have a blueprint to offer. So thank you all so much.
Well, I'll take as my jumping off point. I think Ross is right that there's something deeply strange about Catholics being handed the keys to the proverbial American car on multiple branches of government, when in living memory, there was substantial suspicion of allowing Catholics to serve in any political office, and substantial tension about JFK serving. Could he be a loyal, true American while also being a Catholic? And wouldn't there be some points at which he'd have to pick? And I think you get the sense, looking at certainly parts of the American establishment, Catholics have become less scary. More scary maybe on a few particular issues on the left, but relatively domesticated, reasonably safe. And I'm here basically to make the case that that's a bad thing. So I'm going to start with a different period of the church living under a slightly decadent, flawed empire, the Roman one, and then zip ahead to the present to compare and contrast a little between a few different ways of engaging with American politics. One of the earliest letters we have describing the early church that's outside the Bible is the letter to Diogenes. You can look up the correct Greek pronunciation later, where he's just describing how odd the early Christians are. And he says, with regard to dress, food, and manner of life in general, they follow the customs of whatever city they happen to be living in, whether it is Greek or foreign. And yet there is something extraordinary about their lives. They live in their own countries as though they were only passing through. They play their full role as citizens, but labor under all the disabilities of aliens. Any country can be their homeland, but for them their homeland, wherever it may be, is a foreign country. Like others, they marry and have children, but they do not expose them. They share their meals, but not their wives. And it's a little interesting because parts of this catalog of countercultural Christian tradition, have become commonplace today, and some parts of it actually have become startling again. When you look at that little triad of clauses there, they marry and have children, but do not expose them. At this point in America, all three of those are a little surprising. Neither marriage, nor having children, nor being unwilling to kill children that you find excessive or disabled are clearly marked out as normal within the culture. Each of those witnesses is still offered by Catholics today. Marriage, children, they do not kill them, and is a slightly jarring counter-witness to contemporary American culture. And where I'd like to zoom ahead here is that question of what are the different ways Catholics try and live in the world as Americans, and where do we choose to offer friction to the surrounding culture, and where do we choose to assimilate or blend in? And I'd stick with, of those three, marry, have children, do not expose them with the last, with the contemporary form of infanticide being abortion in America, a practice that is as common and kind of frequently practiced without comment in at least parts of the country as infanticide was in ancient Rome, a matter of basic personal responsibility, as well as kind of a civic loyalty to your surrounding community, to discard the people who you are not prepared to support or do not expect others will support. And this is a practice that Christianity drove out of ancient Roman culture, to the point where infanticide, the word, is startling in America today, but the practice a few months earlier is not. So the question is, what happened then, and what could happen now for a genuine moral revolution? And what I want to contrast is two contemporary ways of engaging in American politics, not because we have to pick between them, but because I think they represent very different parts of the Catholic American tradition for engaging, especially when we are on the back foot, making a big ask of the country. I want to contrast trap laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers, which is kind of a comprehensive legal strategy that are meant to, from for Dobbs, be a way of shutting down abortion clinics without technically banning abortion, with the personal practices of Lauren Handy, who's been in federal prison for the last 10 months and is awaiting sentencing in May. I'll come back to her. Trap laws are, I think, not particularly liked by anyone, as an actual legal practice. These are the laws that say basically, the problem with abortion clinics isn't abortion. I'm definitely not saying it's abortion. Roe v. Wade means I can't say it's abortion. The problem is the hallways are too narrow for patient safety. And this is the kind of law that was passed in a number of red states before Dobbs because it reliably could close clinics. It wasn't an anti-abortion law technically, It was a law about hallways. And understandably, I think the pro-choice movement found this very frustrating. But I found it frustrating as a pro-lifer because, of course, it's all premised on the idea that widening the hallways is going to be too expensive for the clinic to manage. So if you set them wide enough, they can't revise the whole clinic, it shuts down. But the premise of the argument is a little canny, a little sneaky, and a little disingenuous of like, gosh, if only the hallways were wider, we'd have no objection, right? It'd be fine. It's a shame you weren't able to do the capital campaign for the hallways. I was as upset as you were. Too bad, yeah. And that's where I don't see kind of the startling witness of Christians as political actors that you see in that letter of the early church. There's something different about these people. There's something strange about them. There's something more generous and almost imprudent. And I actually think it's that imprudence that we should look for to mark what Christian political engagement has to have at least some of the time. Because Christians, all Christians, not just Catholics, are making the claim that we do not act solely by our own efforts. That the things we do that are valued by the world are not the most valuable things we do. And that we're able to take risks in generosity that we have no reason to believe will pay off. Because when we do them out of love and unite them with Christ's sacrifice on the cross, we know that they are not wasted in the economy of grace, even if we don't see the fruit in our day-to-day life. And that brings me to Lauren Handy, currently in prison. Lauren Handy is part of a group called the Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising, and I think her lawyer would say she didn't break the law. I think it's relatively obvious that she did. When she and a group of friends went into an abortion facility in Washington, D.C., went through the door, sat down, and refused to leave. They didn't offer any kind of violent resistance to employees. They stayed there. They spoke to any mothers in the waiting room who would speak to them. They prayed and sang hymns. Eventually, when police were called, and you informed them as though they didn't know that they were trespassing, they refused to leave and offered passive, nonviolent resistance, and then were ultimately carried out. And the reason why they did that was twofold. One, for as long as they were trespassing, the policy of the clinic was that they would not perform abortions while there was an active security situation going on. Regardless of how dangerous or chaotic the situation was, they were simply sitting and praying or singing. No abortions happened while they were physically in the room. And two, as Lauren told me when I interviewed her, if you were at risk of dying, wouldn't you want someone there trying to stop it? And if they couldn't, wouldn't you want them to stay by the place where you would die for as long as they could, hoping you might survive and wishing they could meet you? And so for her, it was that imprudent, in the eyes of the world, act of physical presence and companionship that I think, not only kind of confounded some of the cops and the clinic workers, but I think was still perplexing a little bit to the judge, right? That matter of hours, you can get off a lot easier if when they say, excuse me, you may not have realized you're trespassing if you go at that point. You may not even get arrested. It's a matter of hours and appointments that may be rescheduled, so why stay as long as you possibly could when her sentence may be up to 10 years? And the reason is that Lauren is imprudent in the eyes of the world. And also that she has a certain freedom to her actions because she acts, with an eye towards eternity and not just towards short-term political gain. Lauren was trespassing, allegedly and also in the eyes of the judge when she entered the clinic. And the judge, for her trespassing, sent her to jail awaiting sentencing. And from her point of view, this meant she sort of got to trespass twice. Once with permission. But she entered two spaces she's not supposed to be. She's not supposed to be in the clinic. Pretty much everyone agrees on that except Lauren, right? And for the most part, none of us can just walk into jail. To stay in jail past visiting hours, you'd either have to break in, which is a pretty unusual thing to do, or you have to get permission from a judge by being sentenced for a crime, which she's sneakily done, and then gets to accompany a different group of people who usually have no one standing in solidarity with them, specifically in love. So when I talked to her, she didn't see going to jail as an interruption of her pro-life work, but as a continuation of it. as one other way to stand where very few people get to stand, which she saw as a privilege, and be in presence and companionship with people who are otherwise ignored, shut out, made invisible. I think the challenge for Catholics trying to live as Americans, as loyal Americans, is that we have to expect there will be compromises that are asked of us that we cannot make. We have to expect that there are things that are in the culture that we want to find a way to oppose. It doesn't always mean that the form of that opposition means going to jail. But we should expect to live uncomfortably in the world. It should feel a little risky to make, for everyone, not just for pro-choicers, to let this many Catholics on the Supreme Court, to have this many Catholics run the conservative movement, because there are real evils on both sides of the political divide that require opposition, and Catholics should always be a little strange, a little too generous, and a little too profligate, because we don't act solely out of worldly concerns, and we trust in God. I think what's odd is the American politician who sort of best embodies what I'm talking about, who everyone agrees is a weirdo, who many people, whether they agree with him on the merits or not, just find hard to work with because he's unreasonable in this way. He doesn't understand that you have to go along to get along sometimes. He says he's doing something out of principle, but he really means it, is Mitt Romney, who belongs to perhaps the most American, even more so than American Protestantism there at the founding. Harold Bloom makes the case that American Mormonism is the most American religion. But I think he's someone who clearly, while being deeply engaged in politics, while in no way being a quietist, even while he finds friction in engaging, he's engaged, he's held high political office, he's run for president, he unsettles people. People find they can't do business with him in the way that they're accustomed to being able to find other fellow travelers in their movement reasonable. And I think that's not a bad standard for Catholics to consider. Further on in the letter, it talks about how Catholics living faithfully in the world will always encounter opposition and persecution. And I think that's something people are more willing to acknowledge within many of the quadrants that Professor Deneen talked about last night. And I think the struggle is having the right reaction to that kind of conflict and persecution. I think there are two disordered reactions you can have to being in the opposition, two ways of romanticizing persecution that are bad for you and your opponent. One is the idea that once I'm being persecuted enough, I get to fight back and fight back dirty. Once I'm sufficiently the underdog, once the normal avenues of power aren't open to me, I get to cheat, and I get to fight back hard. I think that's simply not part of the Christian story, and is more a way of relishing persecution while ignoring the soul of the persecutor, ignoring the real desire that you be united together in heaven. And the other is kind of a quietist, like joy in martyrdom, again, ignoring the actual persecutor of like, oh, yes, we're on the back foot, we get to nobly lose, and I'm just going to go down so hard, losing all the way very faithfully, and my persecution will be glorious. And that's not Lauren's approach. She would prefer not to go to jail, all things considered. She would prefer not to occupy clinics. She won't miss it if she gets to stop it because the killings have ended. In both of those disordered reactions to the friction Catholics encounter in the world, there's a real blindness to the human soul of the person you're in opposition to. It is not good for your persecutor to keep persecuting you, even if you find a way through that's helpful to you, because your persecutor is also loved by Christ, and like St. Paul, is being called to real conversion. So I think the challenge is in finding ways of making Catholic political life at every level, from elected officials to ordinary people here, a way of seeking to enter into real conflict, not being shy about it, but entering it with joy and generosity. That when we encounter those moments of opposition, of tension, of contradiction, to remember that we are a people saved through his wounds, and to look at those moments of conflict as a chance to enter into the wounds of Christ with our opponent and both emerge transformed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, very much, and thank you, Ross. And I'm going to invite Ross and Patrick and Emily to come on up here. And while they're coming, I'm going to introduce Patrick Deneen to those of you who weren't here last night. Patrick is professor of political science at Notre Dame University. He earned his BA and PhD degrees from Rutgers. His many important books include The Odyssey of Political Theory, The Politics of Departure and Return, Democratic Faith, Conserving America, Essays on Present Discontents, and his best-selling books, Why Liberalism Failed, and his most recent book, Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. And joining him is Emily Crowder. Dr. Emily Crowder is assistant professor of German and modern languages and literatures at Furman University, where she has taught since 2020. She received her BA from Indiana University, her MA from the University of Mississippi, and her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Her teaching and scholarship focus on the efficacy of study abroad, marginalized German dialects, with an emphasis on language attitudes and language in Grimm's fairy tales. So please give our new panelists a warm hand. So as is customary, when we add panelists up here, we ask each of them to give some responding remarks, and they're free to do whatever they want in the next 3 minutes. But and they will have more time to address other questions. But Emily, I'll ask you to go first. What were your impressions? What do you want to react to?
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Some of you might be wondering when you heard my introduction, what does she have to do with this? Well, like Leah articulated in her talk, I am one of those scary Catholics living in the world and working in a secular environment. And so I would like to react to what you said and also share some of my experiences here, and also ask for your advice for the scary Catholics or the scary Christians, because lots of my students here, I mean the majority of students at Furman, say that they're Catholic or some form of Christianity. And I think that there's a lot of ecumenical work that we can do with our Christian brothers and sisters on campus and also as colleagues. So, short anecdote, and then I'm going to react to what you said. Last year, I became very scary to some of my students because I taught a course on the origin of language. And it's a linguistics course, and by its nature, we had to look at how language began. Long story short, we don't know. No one knows. And one of the theories we looked at was a biblical interpretation. We spent one day on looking at the Bible, one day out of the 16-week semester. And because of that day, I had to have a meeting with my chair and with our DEI officer because some students felt very threatened and felt like I was pushing some sort of Western Catholic agenda on them. For me, it was terrifying because I thought I was going to lose my livelihood, and I feel a great responsibility being a Catholic professor, a Christian here on campus, to not just teach my students and guide them, but also to help disciple them if they are willing. I don't go into each of my course thinking like, and nothing on you, all the Catholics. I don't do that, yeah? But if they're open to the truth, I feel it's my responsibility to guide them there. So my question for you would be, what is your advice for professors like me and for students who I know many of them feel scared to share their opinion in class because it is such a hostile environment at times to open Christians and Catholics?
Let's go ahead and just go for it.
You know, I think one thing that's important to remember is everyone in the classroom can be scared at once. I think it's often the case that both the Christians are afraid of the non-Christians and the non-Christians are afraid of the Christians at the same time. And we often kind of try and adjudicate these things by which group holds more power over the other. And sometimes they both hold enough power to be threatening. And it's not so much a reassurance to just, it's like when you tell a kid, like, the bees are more afraid of you than they are of them. It just not stop them from stinging you, right? And I think the thing that's encouraging, I've been on both sides of this. I've been an atheist, scared of or hostile to Christians. Then I've been a Christian who's like, I'm worried the atheists are scared of or hostile to me, as I was, right? And one of the biggest things that's different is that I don't think of myself as acting solely out of my own power or my own strength. I think of myself as part of a relay race. So my own conversion was affected not just by a single conversation, there was one that was more pivotal, but by many people taking generous risks on my behalf without seeing any fruit born in the moment. Sometimes like extremely not, right? Like might have come home and said like, well, I talked to Leah and I just don't know if there's that much point in engaging with people anymore. And I think that's really the Christian hope, that nothing we do in love and in generosity fortified by prayer is wasted. Can it mess up your life? Yes, absolutely. But that's where I think really being rooted in a community of prayer and really making sure you're doing things for the love and good of the other person is the best way to go into a hard conversation. And the real confidence of not necessarily seeing fruit born in your day. If I'm lucky enough to see heaven, there will be people there who I get to thank for the first time, not having realized that they prayed in secret for me, who made a difference to my life. Thank you.
Ross, do you wish to respond, or?
Mostly I'm feeling grateful that I asked to go before Leah in the opening. I think that's wonderful advice. It's an odd. So you're talking about the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Is this?
Well, the Tower of Babel is actually many. You can do Old Testament, New Testament.
Right,
so
Pentecost, and one sort of odd thing about the era we're in, right, is that I spend a lot of time talking about sort of America's, in certain ways, I think, ineradicably Protestant character, but obviously a large swath of American culture is now sort of, I would say, still fairly Protestant in character without having, not only not having Protestant beliefs, but not having sort of basic biblical literacy, these kinds of things, right? And I was teaching a course at Yale this year about, had to do with sort of scientific and philosophical arguments about the nature of reality and the existence of God and so on, and we got to, the week we were talking about the implications of Darwinian evolution for certain aspects of Christian belief, and I spent a lot of time talking about the fall in the Garden of Eden, and you sort of realize partway through, you're like, do these kids know the story of the fall in the Garden of Eden, right? And I feel like you're often caught in this dynamic where it's like there's people who know just enough about Christianity to be threatened by it, right? And so you're trying to, in effect, offer. Often you're a long way from sort of offering a Christian confession. You're offering just sort of an introduction to basic knowledge about their own patrimony and the history of intellectual life in the Western world and so on. And figuring out just how to frame that as a sort of an act of generosity, right? Hi, I'd like to, I'm not here to, tell you about Jesus Christ just yet. I'd just like you to know a little bit about, what happens in the Bible, a book that you may have heard of, right? That's an interesting challenge that I will say, not just in my limited experience as an academic, but my much more extensive experience as someone who writes a column for the New York Times. I wrestle with that quite a bit. But the journalist has an advantage over the academic, and I think this point applies beyond just sort of specific controversies about religion. I think in general, it's harder to be an academic in the current intellectual climate in a lot of ways than it is to be a journalist. Because journalism, in the end, your readers complaining about you is actually part of the job description for journalists in a way that, especially for the academic bureaucracy, it's a lot more fraught, I think.
Okay, thank you. Patrick?
It's such a rich conversation, and I have a million things going through my mind. But I guess let me start. Part of the response is I'll start with, in some ways, with Rome, and it's quite interesting to think about in relationship to, beginning with the example of the letter. I always have a problem pronouncing it. Douthat. In relationship to the early Christians in Rome, how eerily and weirdly similar it was in some senses to the situation of Catholics in America. And it's not without good reason that in exactly the ways that Ross was describing, that the many of the Catholics who come here come with what could be, as often described as a kind of ghetto mentality. That Catholics set up their own societies, understanding that they were a minority in the culture. And it wasn't all that rare that one would hear one way of describing this is that we were once again living in the catacombs. That Catholics had to live in the catacombs in a regime that was inherently hostile to them. And that the life as a Catholic in America was a bit like living in the New Rome, albeit not necessarily pagans, but Protestants. Still living Protestants, but Catholics. One wonders if at some point there was a discussion about what it would be like to live in a Catholic society. That the letter that's written is about what it's like to live simply as a Catholic in a dominantly pagan society, in which the way of life is fundamentally different. How people married, how people raised children, whether they did raise children, whether they exposed children. And whether or not it was something that could be conceived to govern or to be in a Catholic society. And I would have to say that in many ways I suspect that it was not. That it was simply, as that letter lays out, this is what it is to be a Catholic. This is what it is to be a Christian. There's no distinction between Catholics and non-Catholics. This is what it was to be a non-Catholic Christian. This is what it is to be a Christian. This is how one lives as a Christian. And really what the development of Christianity in the West is simply people, pagans, looking at the Christians and looking at how they lived and the oddness and the uniqueness of how they lived and concluding that is a beautiful way of life. That is an amazing way of thinking about the world. And just the numbers, the sheer numbers of conversions that happened in the early church. Those of us who are Catholic Christians, maybe other denominations, this is the time of year when we're reading the Acts of the Apostles and our masses, and just the massive conversions that are happening in the church. This little rump society that was in the catacombs, after 300 years, is declared to be the official religion of Rome. And from that point forward becomes the religion of the West. Becomes Christendom, in which sort of everyone living in that society is a Christian. This is not a top-down imposition of Christianity that Constantine demanded. I mean, it was in some senses, there were still pagans around. But it was really Constantine's own decision to declare Christianity as the state religion of Rome, was the result of a kind of reading the polls, reading the returns and saying, this is where my people are going. And so kind of putting together these comments in an interesting way, I think, not that I'm interested in, an interesting connection is that for Catholics living in America, confronting the similar America that Ross described, a nation that at the very beginning Catholics regarded and suspected was not a friendly country to them. The response was not that we simply accept that we're going to be a kind of rump society. The response was, having lived through Rome, we desire the conversion of America. And if there's one through line in Orestes Brownson thought, he was constantly having debates in his own mind, it was that the end and purpose of what it is to be a Catholic in America is to seek its conversion, to seek that the whole country, like is in most religions less than 50% today. And those who are increasingly visibly and vocally Catholic in our country are increasingly converts. It's becoming a faith increasingly not of the masses, but of the intellectuals. I don't know about you, but
I'm a cradle Catholic.
so, okay, about 50% cradle Catholics.
Well,
But
if we let the baby be the tiebreaker.
three out of 5 of us are cradle Catholics. One of us not quite cradle. Where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is that if your faith is increasingly led by the elites, I guess my question is, to be a member of the elites means that you really can't be weird. It's really hard to be an elite in America and be weird. Be that person that's really an outlier. You don't get to join the elites. I know this from having taught in elite schools my entire life. By being weird. Elites are desperately afraid of being weird and sticking out and being strange and saying or speaking things that the followers are. So in many ways, we're faced with this kind of, I can see being Catholics in America are faced, A, with a problem that it's a natively hostile place like Rome was. But the conversion of Rome was perhaps as unlikely as the conversion of America was, but with one key and critical difference. There was Christendom in between then and now. And Christendom in many ways has ceased to exist, at least as a thing, but the conditions for its conversion may not be there in the sense that Christianity today is not, it's increasingly a kind of, at least in the Catholic world, increasingly seems to be driven by elites, I mean, as the friend Professor Nelson began by saying. So I think this real question of the nature of this faith and many of our faiths today, as a kind of mass early phenomenon, is one that it seems to me it's going to be one that maybe without having quite thought through yet, it's going to be a major challenge for the faith going forward. Not only about the sheer numbers, but the capacity of the faithful to be weird and to be an example that could lead to the kinds of conversions that the early church, to its own surprise perhaps, witnessed. Was witness of.
Yeah, didn't Tocqueville say that in this social state there would be a strong pressure to conform? There should be.
The tyranny of the majority.
Well, that, and yeah, there would be no odd duck aristocrats any longer. And so, that was just a minor point. Leah and Ross, do you have any comments before we move on?
I think the elite like having a couple weirdos around, like the way you have ornamental furniture. That's my niche, right? I think there's room always for a few weirdos in the mix, including just because people get bored with conformity. You'll see the way that major newspapers, I think, will platformer profile folks who are incredibly inimical to their own culture and desires because there's just a certain fascination. Why would someone live this way? And it's a whole range of folks who get that kind of treatment. But when you don't love the conformity around you, it does provoke a certain level of wondering, what would it mean to live my life differently? Should I do a lot of meditation retreats and not eat for 11 hours a day, like this tech founder? That's weird. Like, he's rich. There's something going on there. Should I, think about my whole life as converting work hours and salary into malaria nets, like some people involved in effective altruism? Like, that kind of puts a real weight on the human life, that it's a project for saving lives. It's weird and it's compelling. You see people make a lot of weird, semi-generous, semi-extreme swings because I think people have a sense that they want more to be asked of them. And I think Ross is one best equipped to speak to kind of all the weird, different New Age pseudo-religions that kind of spring up as a response to this appetite. But I think what's really common is that folks will pull in a lot of weirdos for at least brief consultations to say, you're living your life in a very big way, and I don't like the smallness of my life. Would I dare do the big, hard thing you're doing? I think the frustrating thing is, not that people don't have an appetite for pouring their life out for others, is that they have a lot of terrible options on offer and have trouble sorting through them. But people have an enormous appetite to live their life for others, to do something big, to live sacrificially, and then struggle to find a community to sustain it or find a sacrifice worthy of what they want to give.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, you can think about maybe two slightly distinct problems in the style. I agree that there's some modest room for weirdness in the American elite, especially in the American elite that has more self-doubt, I think, today than it did 15 or 20 years ago. But how you get from there to conversion and transformation, I think, is the harder question. And one answer is that it's not an intellectual project in the end, right? That it doesn't matter what you think about Jefferson and Adams and Orestes Brownson, and the relationship between Madison and Thomas Aquinas or anything like that. What matters is, in fact, that in a sort of aging, fairly unhappy society, Catholics and all Christians need to pattern modes of ordinary life, raising kids, having families, building schools, building communities that yield the kind of reaction that the early Christians got from the Romans. It wasn't just like, there's one Christian and he's a weird guy. There's this one saint and we torched him and he didn't complain. No, it was that there are these communities, right, that are attractive and offer a different model of existence. And I think that, for sort of middle to upper middle class Catholics who are not fully part of the elite and maybe have such large families that they never will be, right? There's a lot of plausible work to be done. It's already being done to some extent in figuring out, what does a healthy Christian marriage look like after the sexual revolution and after, in a post-industrial economy and so on. How can Christians model healthy marriages in a society turning away from marriage and family? And then how can this either extend to working class life, or how can it be in fruitful dialogue with the forms of evangelicalism and Pentecostalism that seem to flourish more in middle class and working class America? Those are sort of practical, non-intellectual challenges for the actual elites, right? People who are Supreme Court justices, politicians, and even, God help us, Notre Dame professors, and New York Times columnists, and so on, right? I think there's a question of narrative. America doesn't have a narrative right now. The last clear conservative narrative died with George W. Bush. The last clear liberal narrative, and I mean, not a narrative of doom and disaster, right? But an optimistic narrative, a narrative about how it's good to be an American, basically ended when Barack Obama's first term gave way to the rise of wokeness and left-wing pessimism. So you have a lot of pessimism about America and a lot of very narrow understandings of what America is and should be, what our national story is. And if you're an elite, you're in the storytelling business and the governance business, you're trying to put those together and say, here's the story of America that encompasses a lot of things that seem in tension right now, but in fact can be made to fit together. And I think that's part of what you're looking for as a Catholic elite in this country founded by Protestants, right? What is the story that unites the best parts of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century with the 21st century? And again, I think Catholics are not especially well positioned to figure that out because it's not clearly a Catholic story that we're sort of taking over. We're coming in and trying to make something of it. But that's what you have to try and do, I think. That's sort of the elite, apart from sort of policy questions, that's an elite project that actually matters, I think.
Ross, I think your comments about the kind of Protestant roots of America suggest the model for Catholic engagement is the Anglican ordinariate, right? Of bringing in a Protestant tradition that's lasted a long time and genuinely trying to seek to find out what is best in it as it's encompassed into the whole.
Yes, I think that's a plausible example, but it's sort of the very particularity of that suggests the problem. I mean, you could frame it just in terms of let's suppose that tomorrow apostles of Patrick Deneen were suddenly tenured. We're suddenly tenured at Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and they wandered out into the campus, and it's filled with the monuments of Puritanism, right? And like, what do you do with that sort of particularly American inherent? I mean, I'm a New Englander. I'm a descendant of those Puritans, right? And I have sort of odd conversations with my Catholic children. Like, what do we think? What do we think about the Puritans who are buried all over New Haven, Connecticut, who founded these utopian religious republics and who hated Catholics? And I'm not completely sure what the answer is.
Well,
Let's hear what the answer is.
I do want to circle back. 5 minutes ago, I thought I was going to be circling back to something we weren't talking about, but now we're talking about it again. Let me ask a very simple question, but for those of us who are conservative Protestants, who have been raised in America and never thought that we were living in a Protestant country. It just, we knew that, but it was the air we breathed. It was the water we swam in. Nothing seems that different about America, or nothing seems odd about America. When I listen to you all talk, I get this deep sense that there is this sense that we are Catholics and America is something different. Tell me what that is. I haven't figured it out yet. What exactly makes you really bristle sometimes at America as America, the Protestant nation?
So I'll make a pitch to the Protestants first to feel a little less at home in America, and then I'll say my largest beef with America, which is, I think, that statement about the early church is a statement for all Christians. That because we live with our eyes on the kingdom of God, and because we live and are ourselves touched by sin, we're a little divided against ourselves, and we find parts of the world that both invite us to cooperate with grace and parts that frustrate us, right? So just an easy life of assimilation is not an option for any Christian in any country. Because there's no country, even kind of formal Christendom, that is itself the kingdom of God. And so I just don't think that should be a hard pitch for Protestants, and it certainly wasn't for many of the Protestants who founded the nation, who escaped religious persecution, but also had a strong sense of trying to be leaven for the world, and thinking of the world as a place that needed leavening. Now, what's wrong with America?
How long you got?
I'm gonna give a capsule pitch, right? Of like, what's a partial truth that America embraces and sets above a bigger truth? And I think that is liberal autonomy. That America, more than most other countries, is the land of self-made people, the land of meritocracy, the land of rising by your own efforts, and it really takes as its image the individual as the fundamental unit of society. And when that's how you think about what citizenship means, what personhood means, you're describing a fictional person. People don't begin their lives autonomous. My baby is not autonomous right now, and even though he'll get certain legal protections when he's born versus at this moment, he will not be autonomous when he is born. He'll be able to breathe on his own, but not eat unassisted or move or take care of his diapers. It's been a prolonged period independence. And then, if I'm lucky to live so long, he'll take care of me in my decrepitude, as I also don diapers and enter a prolonged period that's very embarrassing if what I'm meant to be is autonomous. And the whole middle is dappled by dependence, whether that comes through illness, through childbearing, through poverty, through caring for someone else, through disability. And the American story does not put weakness at the heart of what we think it means to be a person. And when we don't do that, not only does everyone kind of slip in and out of personhood at the beginning and ends and middles of their lives, but we cannot know ourselves as Christians if our tale of ourself is autonomy. Because we're all fundamentally, utterly dependent on God and on salvation in Jesus Christ.
I guess in that sense, I agree completely with that. even as America has become secular, that secularism is simply a continuation of its Protestantism. And this is where, even when someone can say, well, it's not a Protestant nation anymore, it's increasingly a secular nation. Well, that secularism takes a particular form. And it is the sort of, you could say, the nth development of Protestantism, as Tocqueville anticipated, as Orestes Brownson anticipated, as many people anticipated, which is that it will, the logic at the heart of individualism at the heart of Protestantism will eventually devolve to a declaration of independence, not only from all churches, but from God. But it's simply a kind of, you could say, the inner logic, at least according to this view, of what was always here in the nation. In fact, Tocqueville has this really interesting and I think pretty prophetic line that the future of America will be a future of those who claim independence of all churches and Catholics. That he thinks that's the future of America, which is one reason why
He had not heard about non-denominational Protestantism.
Well,
That was his.
They're on their way. Anyway, but I think that, in other words, I think that even as one can claim, well, this doesn't seem like a Protestant nation anymore, it's not dominated by any particular Protestant sect. I think from the Catholic viewpoint, it still is a fundamentally Catholic nation in that respect.
Well, I mean, I would say, like, I'm an American. I'm, you know, I bristle at aspects of the Catholic political tradition because I'm an American, right? All of the aspects of sort of Protestant individualism just described are things that resonate with me at some deep instinctive level, right? And I think they contain, you know, elements of the truth about the human condition that, in certain forms, Catholicism tried to suppress, and that, you know, that there has to be, from a Catholic perspective, in the entire drama of Protestantism, you know, even if you think Catholicism is correct and Protestantism is not, you know, God is telling us something by allowing this division within Christendom, and he's not just telling us the Catholics had everything right from the beginning until Luther and Calvin came along and messed things up. No, it's something more complicated than that. So that, I think that's important to stress. Catholics engaging with the American political tradition are not just called upon to correct it, they are called upon to learn something from it, and from its undeniable success. God has blessed the United States of America in a profound way. The other small thing I'd add, just to, since I mentioned the Puritans, the other thing is it is a Protestant individualism, but then it's also this kind of, you know, moral perfectionism and utopianism, right? That is, I think, also sort of, it's the other side of the coin, right? That, like, on the one hand, we're all sort of free, rights-bearing individuals. On the other hand, we're here, you know, forming the perfect community in which, you know, in the good church there will be no, you know, there won't be sinners, right? The sinners will be subjected to church discipline and set outside the door. That's not what Catholics do. And that, I think, that impulse definitely survives in secular form, right? That a lot of secular progressivism has this idea that, you know, at a certain point, we just shouldn't have the bad people anymore, right? And that too is part of the inheritance that runs from the Puritanism of Yale and Harvard to the progressivism of Yale and Harvard, I would say.
Emily, what's it like to be at a Protestant sort of school?
It doesn't feel Protestant, I would say. When I tell people I work at Furman and they know the history, they're like, oh, well, you must feel so encouraged working at a Baptist, you know, Christian, you share, you know, Christian ideals. This is the only private institution I've worked at. The other two institutions were public, and this one feels the most progressive, the most woke, the most anti-Christian. And so I don't really feel the Protestant influence on campus, at least in my experience so far that I've been here. What I wanted to say earlier, living as an American, I kind of, Ross, when you were talking about us culturally appropriating, I was like, wait, what? Is my whole life a lie? What is it? I had never had that thought, but I think where it appears in my life and what I have noticed is in Catholic thought, we don't shy away from the raw and kind of almost the ugly. Like we have, like Leah was saying last night, we have the crucifix in every church and we meditate on the wounds of Jesus, whereas you don't see that in most Protestant churches. Even here on campus, our chapel, we don't, have the crucifix there. It's just, I don't even know if we have a cross. In the back corner. In the back corner.
On the
very top, yeah. So that is how I have seen it present itself, and also in sexuality. Catholics really, it goes down to the Eucharist, but we embrace our bodies. We're not scared of sex. We're not scared of our bodies, and Pope John Paul II really helped this movement through the theology of the body, through understanding how our bodies were created by God, and actually sexuality is a really holy thing, and it's a beautiful thing, whereas kind of the Protestant, I don't want to get myself in trouble, not the Protestant, but the Puritan kind of history is, bodies, you have to be careful, you have to, that's something that, you have to cover up, and something that you don't talk about, and maybe sex is shameful. So I think there is a lot of misunderstanding between the two, and a lot more connections that we can make with our Protestant brothers and sisters.
One thing I'm curious about, we did a little census of who you raised cradle and who you raised convert. I'm curious how recently each of your families came to America, because it's my grandfather and grandmother on one side from Italy, and then my great-grandfather and great-grandmothers all across from every bit of Europe that had previously kicked us out for being Jews. And so I don't resonate as much with some parts of what you New England and Ross do, because I think my family still has a strong tradition of America both being a place of refuge and opportunity, but not a trustworthy one, right? And not one that we've been rooted in forever, something that we're both loyal to and grateful for, and not entirely welcome in.
Yeah, we go. My mother's right. The Douthats came in the 18th century. They were Northern English and then Scottish borders types. So they were recent. That's the recent immigrant side of my family. My mother's family are Snows, and the Snows were on the second ship after the Mayflower, and Nicholas Snow married Constance Hopkins, who was on the Mayflower. So, yeah, it goes, yeah. What's the Good Shepherd, which is this terrible movie with Matt Damon playing the, WASP head of the CIA. But, there's the Italian mobsters, like, I don't get you, you people, the Jews have their family, and we Italians, we got the church, and, what do you people have? Damon's like, we have the United States of America. The rest of you are just visiting. That's
We are Lutheran Germans, and then Irish Catholics.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar to you. Yeah, so I'm the only real Puritan.
I guess it's one of the most unique parts of America that people both have real joy and relief in coming here and sustained friction. And I do think of that as part of the American inheritance and part of what makes an American community is, even across different generations, that experience of both being welcomed and not at home.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I think that's an important point, because as a Christian, I know I'm supposed to feel uncomfortable. And I feel guilty because I don't feel uncomfortable enough in America. And my father immigrated. I'm first generation. But they loved this country, and that's all I got at home was, this is the greatest country. The old country, I never want to go back to. But I so appreciate what you've said, Leah, because that is the Pauline approach approach, that is the biblical approach. And yet, I think for some of us Protestants in America, we have a hard time figuring out how unusual we should be.
I'm proud to be American, at least I know I'm free.
And I want to pick a fight with Emily for 1 second. The Puritans napped on Sunday afternoons. What do you think they were doing? They were as sexual as anybody else. I'm just going to leave it right there.
How else would people with children with wonderful names like God's judgment upon you, Douthat?
I'll take one faculty question and one student question. So Evan, you're up, and then David, you're up. And here comes MC. She's got the microphone.
So this is for mostly Sergeant Douthat. So you were talking about, I guess scary Christians, but there's 2 other Christians that I want to, almost criticize and see how, the Mormons from the faith can respond. The first are the ones that will look at certain Christians and say, oh, we're not like those ones. And it's more that they just, kind of want to have the right opinions, you say. And the other ones are the ones that they're criticizing, the ones that actually are hateful Christians and actually are using religion to be hateful. It's not that they have, conservative values, they actually are hateful. And so my question is, a lot of the other Christians kind of might just want to play on the sideline or something, but how can Christians or Catholics for that matter, specifically, show Christian love and charity and expose themselves to the world, and also maybe even try to unite the other 2 Christian groups that are attacking each other as well?
Yeah, so this is a huge failure. And it's a case in my own lifetime where the problem you described has gone from being a really profound Catholic problem to also being a really profound, I think, evangelical Protestant problem, right? So it used to be that I had an evangelical friend who would be invited to Catholic panels, and he would go and he would say, oh, I thought I was going to be the token Protestant arguing with these Catholics, but it turns out these Catholics all hate each other. The post-Vatican II liberal Catholics hate the post-Vatican II conservative Catholics, and vice versa, and you have this, long-running, pretty, by intellectual standards, brutal inter-Catholic civil war. I think the Trump era has created a very similar dynamic with a lot of evangelicals, where the evangelicals who basically stuck with the political right think that the evangelicals who broke with Trump are elitist, quisling sellouts, who've been bought and paid for by George Soros, right? And the evangelicals who were on the right and then broke with the right because of Trump think that their co-religionists are captive to a heathen monster who's destroying America. Is that a fair, I think that's a fair capsule summary of the competing views. And, this is sort of, it's a cop-out to say, I can see where both sides are coming from, but I can see where both sides of that divide are coming from. I can understand why a lot of conservative evangelicals felt politically homeless after Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, and I can also understand, given developments on the political left in the last 10 or 15 years, given the sort of particular policy stakes around issues like abortion, why, in the end, most conservative evangelical voters stuck with Donald Trump and the Republican coalition. And, there are particular cases and people, I won't mention any names, but who do fit the stereotypes, people I do think sort of sold out either to Trump or to the libs, right? But most of the people caught up in that divide are just doing the best they can in a pretty difficult political situation. And part of the dynamic we're describing that Catholics have always faced in America, sort of a novelty, maybe for Protestants to have to make really tough political choices, but guess what? In a de-Christianizing America, you're going to make some tough political choices, and while you're making those tough political choices, you have to have some charity for the people who make a different judgment about the tough choice. And so there are people who I know personally who are evangelicals on both sides of the divide, who I have sort of watched in despair over the last 5 years as they've gone from being friends and allies to being worse enemies to each other than either is to non-Christians. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure I'm guilty of this myself too in inter-Catholic debates. I got in some pretty hot Pope Francis era feuds inside Roman Catholicism. You know, this happens to all of us. But it is really, really, really a strong counter-witness. It's the opposite of the witness that, you know, Christians in the letter of the unpronounceable name from the Roman era offer, right? And you really have to find a way to understand why, you know, when there is a division among people who share religious faith, having charity to people who are on the other side of that division is just really, it's really essential to Christianity.
I think Ross did a really good.
Yeah, we're really up on time. I want to give David the last question. I don't know if we can get an answer, but we can get a question.
Okay, I'll do it. I'm just going to make a statement then. David Gandolfo, I'm in the philosophy department here. Educated at 3 Catholic universities, taught at 3 Catholic universities before coming to Furman. They were all Jesuit, though. I'm familiar with the...
Don't tempt me. Don't tempt me.
I think that to the extent that American Catholic thought enters the mainstream dialogue, it enters primarily as a critique of various sexual things, like a critique of homosexuality for the most part, heavy emphasis on the abortion issue, and what is missing, what doesn't get brought in, is the prophetic teaching of Catholic social teaching, the prophetic teaching of this tremendously powerful body of thought coming out of Latin American liberation theology. That these things that are very strongly focused on social justice get overlooked when Catholic leaders and Catholic thought leaders focus so heavily on critiquing homosexuality. And I would suggest that is a huge part of the reason why Catholic churches are empty. The best kept secret of Catholicism is Catholic social thought and liberation theology, and it's a secret, right? And the various speakers are talking about ways of being weird, and I think you know, a more traditional word would be ways of being prophetic, right? And one is prophetic by insisting that on social justice, insisting that this great and growing gap between rich and poor, both within the U.S. and globally, insisting on Pope Francis' insistence on the sin of destroying the planet. This is the kind of prophetic. It's the aspect of Catholic prophecy that's missing because we spend so much time critiquing homosexuality.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry.
I'm willing to take a brief swing at it.
Okay, take your...
Responding to,
I think the real challenge here is, often for the Catholic Church, that the world mostly hears our no to a contemporary practice and not what yes that no is for the sake of. And I think long before there were any fights about gay marriage, there's been a prolonged fight about what marriage is in this country. And the contemporary American definition of marriage is actually a very small and unambitious one for all sexes and all pairings and all numbers, which is some subset of people who love each other and want to live together and probably have sex, like, for a period of time for as long as it works. And that's a much smaller ask. It's less prophetic than saying marriage makes a family, forever. You can separate from your husband if it becomes dangerous, but it doesn't automatically make him not your husband any more than having a bad mother makes her not your mother. Marriage genuinely lets you make a perpetual vow. Marriage is radically open to life, and cannot be forced into sterility either by the nature of who is married or by the application of artificial means to limit what marriage is. So marriage automatically means both making a vow and making a vow that has consequences you can't fully control. And I think that is prophetic and weird and challenging on the level of sell all you have and give it to the poor, share all your goods among yourself. It's a very dangerous teaching to embrace, and it sounds disruptive to a normal American life in a way that contemporary marriage practices don't. And I think one of the challenges for the church, one of the problems of being kind of an elite phenomenon, is that it is always the poor who need the most protection from a watering down of the goods of life. Because it's easier for me to embrace the goods of marriage with my money to protect me and my married parents to model for me. And the more of those supports I lose, the more protection I need, both from the state and the culture, to be able to hold on to the real goods that my boss, my hours, my community may pressure me to give up. But Catholicism straightforwardly asks a lot, and it says that the human life is expansive and prophetic and weird and not constrained, safe, and containable.
Anybody want to follow that one up?
I'm eager to follow that. Great articulation. But I'll respond to one thing that I think touches on the question of Catholics becoming accepted in America on America's terms. And I did speak a bit about this last night. To be accepted in America on America's terms meant at least you had to become somewhat liberal in some dimension of life. Ross was in some ways touching on this, that you had to become an American on Americans' terms, which meant that you had to truncate Catholic social teaching, at least in one dimension. And whether you were going to become more liberal on the economic front, which is what conservatives, Catholics did, or whether you were going to become more liberal on the front of sexuality and morality, which was what more left Catholics did. And I think this is a deep problem that's faced as Americans have become more accepted and desired acceptability within America, was the willingness to truncate the fullness of Catholic social teaching, which I would argue makes no sense unless it's complete and full. And it's not just social justice from a left perspective, it's complete in every respect. But that means that you can no longer truncate the teaching to be accommodated to a liberal order. And in that sense, I think, to the extent that Catholics want to be accepted and become elites in America, that in many ways they've been forced to truncate that teaching. And that presents, we're back to the beginning, which is, can you be genuinely and truly a Catholic and fully accepted in America on the terms that America itself poses?
Okay, we could go on for another hour. But, and I had a long list of people I was going to thank. I just want all the Tocqueville Fellows who are here, please stand up. Thank you. It is for them and for every other student that we do this, but these people have made it possible, and they work so hard behind the scenes. I thank Jim Guth, I thank Lucy Southwell, Beth Larive. They're all part of this great program this year. We have a great lineup next year, so go to our website, put your email address in so you get all the great information, and don't forget us on Dinsday. We need your support. Let's thank our panelists and our speakers. Thank you very much for this.